Okay.
So let's start with Bill English. How did you meet Doug Engelbart and when? Where were you? Start with at the very beginning.
Well, the very beginning when I met Doug was at SRI. I had joined the magnetics lab at SRI, and Doug was an old hand at magnetics. As I understand, Doug, when he first joined SRI, had to pay his way somehow, and magnetics was one of the projects that had sponsors, and Doug didn't have a sponsor at the time, as I remember, and he was doing work in magnetics, and this was the whole area of magnetic logic at the time. There was a big concern about things being immune to radiation, so a big emphasis on building things out of magnetics, which were immune. We were in the process of building an adding machine that was entirely magnetic with no sensitive components.
And what year was this?
Well, now that's a good question. I think I joined the magnetics lab in probably 1960. Does that sound about right? When were you working in magnetics then?
From 57 to sometime so.
And you left magnetics when?
I don't remember. Sorry.
Anyway, I joined in about 1960. And my first contact with Doug was, I knew him there in the lab, but the first real contact was when he had written a paper, and I don't even remember what the paper was on at the time, on some magnetics issue. And he was trying to really concentrate on the Augmented Human Intellect program. So he talked me into giving the paper for him at some conference in the East Coast. And I don't remember what the paper was about or anything at this point, but that was it. And I gave the paper for Doug, and we developed an association. And then when he got some money, he asked me to join him.
Doug, what's your first memory of Bill English?
Probably the laboratory where we were in would have the practice of mid-morning and mid-afternoon gather around a coffee machine or something for talk fest. So there was a new guy showing up, and we got acquainted.
What kind of things would happen around the coffee machines? What kinds of things did you talk about? Do you remember the issues that were you already talking about augment around the coffee machine?
No, there wasn't really an audience for that.
No.
This was the technology of computing was basically what everyone was talking about.
Magnetic computing. Magnetic computing is something that seems to have died out many years ago. Was this one of these blind alleys in computer research?
Well, magnetics are, yeah, it really was, in terms of magnetic logic. I mean, that was the big area of storage in magnetic cores, of course. And there were specialized cores, there were multi-aperture cores for doing logic, and there were a thing called the SHMU core for resettable memory. It was a latch that you could set in the magnetics. There was a lot done with them at the time, and some stuff still works. I know we designed magnetic controls. We designed the magnetic circuits that were running a good part of the New York subway. And they still do. There's still some of those old magnetic circuits running.
You had a contract to?
Actually, we had a contract with AMP Incorporated, who sold the equipment to the Transit Authority in New York. But there were some interesting applications. Toronto hump yard for railroad switching was one also. It was all run. They were totally impervious to any noise. That was what was so neat about them.
And Doug, what do you remember about the outside world in terms of events that was happening when you started Augment? As much about sort of what was going on outside as inside.
Well, it's when I started the pursuit. I'd started all this in 1951, and that's why I went to graduate school and why I came to SRI. And the unspoken agreement was I'd work for my room and board, whatever I could bring in project money for, and that it'd be my responsibility to get this funding that could go after a real program. And so along about 1958, I was still in that lab, but I got a contract to do a study about how you could, the impact of scaling the dimension, the size of electronic components. And there are very interesting phenomena that happen because you make something 1/100th the size, and well, that's 1/100th the length, but some things are depending on area, which is a 10,000th then, or some of them on volume, which is...
But you were thinking about components for a much larger, grander vision, even at the beginning?
Well, yeah, because the kind of picture I had about what the computer interacting, etc., could do in the world, it would require much cheaper, faster, more prevalent. And so knowing the interest that was already there from industry and the government and the military, you could just say, well, if there's a real opportunity for everything to get faster and smaller, then that could all come about. And so could what I would like to do. So I was very lucky to do that. And it just opened a bunch of very interesting doors for me. And one of them was just total conviction that there's going to be all the computer power we ever want.
You could see that as early as the late 1950s?
That's just that there, as you make things smaller and smaller and smaller, old kinds of devices won't work. But there are all kinds of phenomena that can be harnessed in relationships to make a new kind of devices. So it just, boy, it's just a whole frontier. So.
And was the Augment proposal accepted the first time you submitted it?
No.
How many times?
I don't know, but I remember one in particular. There was the National Institutes of Health who were funding rather interesting sort of things in the computer field. And so wrote the proposal, and they came and did a site visit. So 4 people who were pretty senior in the computer field showed up and did the site visit. And when they wrote a letter back later, it was very interesting. It said, well, this is a very challenging thing you're doing and probably is really worth doing. The problem is that it's going to require very advanced computer programming. And since you're way out there in Palo Alto where there aren't any advanced computer programmers, we can't invest the money into it.
And how many years after did you finally get someone to fund Augment?
That was probably a year or more later. The real fortune thing happened was the ARPA opened its first information processing techniques office and brought a guy down from Cambridge to run it who had actually been writing about man-computer symbiosis and things. It turned out his image was quite a bit different from mine, but here I was waiting there with proposals, and one of his friends later, a year or so later, who didn't know who I was, but he was telling me about, oh, and Licklider invested way out there in the Palo Alto area. He says, you know, it's probably not going to place because who in the hell can do anything way out there? But anyway, so he sort of had to give us money because we were talking about doing that thing. The chronology sort of there were about 3 funded things that all had bearing on starting to get actual support.
Why don't we start with the first one? What was this is a Licklider funded project, was the first of the series? No.
No, it was the one from the Air Force gave me that one on the scaling, which just made a real difference.
Okay. And this was still involved in the magnetics lab?
No, I was just sitting there. It didn't have anything to do with magnetics. I just happened to get this, and so they said, okay, you can just stay there and work on this project for 4 months or something.
Okay. And did you submit that proposal by yourself? It wasn't a collaborative proposal. Did you talk to other people about it, or were you pretty much sort of by yourself working on these ideas?
Yeah, I was pretty much by myself. That I'd run across a captain or a lieutenant in the Air Force who was working at Wright Air Development Center, where they had they were funding research. And I mentioned to him the kind of scaling interest kind of thing. Oh, gee, could you do a study on that? So that was the first sort of breakthrough.
And now this work was going on long before the emergence of the integrated circuit. So historically, it's interesting to me that you were thinking about scaling before the IC.
Right. And so so I gave a talk at it was called the Solid State Circuits Conference in 1959, where I'm telling them about scaling, etc. And it was really fun. It was one of the most rewarding talks I ever did because everybody just got really hyped up. But because I could just start with an example. It's like saying, well, everybody, suppose this room and everybody and everything in it were suddenly increased 10 times in size. Would you notice it? And I could just tell people looking around, they realize, well, he's 10 times farther away, but he's 10 times as tall, so the angle would be the same. So we just wouldn't notice anything. Then you start telling them, well, how much more do you weigh? Oh, 1,000 times as much because you're 1,000 times the volume. Well, how much stronger are you? Well, the strength depends on the area of your bones and cross-section area. So you're only 100 times as strong. Oh.
Now, Bill, did you know about this thinking in this work?
No.
Or this was pretty much, he was off by himself?
Yes, I wasn't involved at that.
That was even before you got there.
Before I got there, yes. Before I got to the magnetics lab.
I see. And when you came to the magnetics lab and you filled in and did this paper for Doug, by that time were you up to speed on some of his ideas?
No, I really wasn't up to speed. I hadn't been talking to Doug much about his ideas at the time. We were involved in magnetics, and we were talking about magnetics a little bit.
I'd been contributing to that in kind of design ways and some patentable things. So it was probably some of that.
Some of those things we talked about.
I would like to phase out of that.
And then the second, Doug, the second grant, what was the second key funding step?
Wasn't the second funding Licklighters?
No. It was something we did. I did, and ended up delivering a paper to the what's the ASIS now, what's called American Documentation Institute or something then. But it was, everybody was starting to talk about computers being able to help libraries.
Oh, yes.
And so I just want to tell them, well, you know, you don't want to think just of how the library crunks through with its indexing and cataloging and things like that. You got to realize that the contributions being made to it are going to be done very differently, and the users are going to be very different. So it's a bigger system you have to think about. And anyway, so that was a second one. And a third.
And how long did it come before the third one?
Well, they were kind of mixed right into there. The third one was an Air Force Office of Scientific Research, which was a small office giving relatively small grants out there for things that were sort of almost out of the box. You know, later I found out that they were all excited about a guy who'd been studying how gnats fly and why they cluster. And I thought, oh boy, I'm in really great company. But that's the one that I got to sit and work out this paper that came out in '62 that really set the whole framework for me. And it was called Augmenting Human Intellect, a Conceptual Framework. But there were a couple of very important steps up to that, and one of them was trying to go talk to people about what I thought computers could do in this sense, and the continual failure. It's, you know, I talked to a person that's in cognitive psychology, and they'd listen a while and they say, well, look, all you're talking about is cognitive psychology, and we're doing that. You're an engineer, you don't have any background. No, I think I'm talking about more. No, you gotta believe me, that's hard. And the next time it'd be some people in information retrieval. And these guys happened to corner me after I'd given a talk, and they went through that same thing. All you're talking about is information retrieval. No, I think it's more than that. Oh no, it isn't, we know. And they actually got angry enough for me to see that it really, they just felt I was trespassing in their area with no real background. And
Bill English, when did you become aware of the broader augmenting human intellect work, and sort of what was your first impression of it?
Well, I think I became aware of the work really when Doug asked if I would join the group at the time.
And that was circa?
63? I think it was 63. And we were in a temporary building, and he had gotten the first computer facility and display set up. And
needed a real engineer.
And he really wanted me to come over and make sure everything worked and get it all together.
Now by 63, 64, in Berkeley, the free speech movement had started to happen. And in your group, were you at all aware of those events, or were you pretty much in isolation from those events that were happening across the Bay?
Not involved in them, but certainly aware of it. No question about being aware of it.
Very aware.
Yes, very aware of it. And of course, when that moved into our domain in Stanford and that area, we couldn't help but be aware.
But even then, in 63, 64, there was the House On-American Activities hearings in San Francisco. Did you have, did you guys have any sympathies, or did this seem like a distant kind of troublemaking event, or how did how did it seem from the research center? Was anything affecting you besides just news, but were you involved in any way?
That's, I'm not sure how to answer that one. I think we were involved certainly in the evolution of this. It seemed like a wonderful, enlightening way to move. Not necessarily the House Un-American Activities nonsense at all, but the free speech movement and all of that seemed very positive and encouraging, and we wanted to be involved in it in any way we could.
It's clear there was a definite empathy.
Definite empathy, for sure.
And how quickly did your first group begin to grow, Doug? I mean, how quickly did you add people, and what was the size of the group during the mid-60s?
Well, there was a first ARPA project we got, which it really couldn't get off the ground well, and you know, this was really due a lot to internal SRI really serious concern about me being a crackpot.
And why did they think you might be a crackpot? What was it? These ideas were just too far out?
Oh, sure. I mean, I had to leave Berkeley. You know, I thought I was going to sit there and, you know, I was acting assistant professor and I thought I was going to do my research, but one Saturday at a barbecue among faculty, an older guy started asking me more about what I was really wanting to do, and I started telling him all like that. He listened. Finally, he said, "Do you know how promotion is done in universities?" And I actually never thought about it. That's how naive I was. So I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "It's by peer review," and he explained more about peer review of papers. If you don't publish papers. So he said, "I can tell you now that if you keep talking about this kind of crazy thing, you'll be an acting assistant professor forever." So I believed him. So that's why I went to SRI. And there was this, have you ever heard the story when I got to SRI that morning to be interviewed?
I'm sure I have.
Go ahead, yeah.
Tell us again.
The first one I talked to was a guy that had been several years ahead of me getting out of Berkeley, the PhD. So talking to him, and I never got a chance to talk about this much at Berkeley, but so I was telling him what I was really wanting to do, and he finally said, "Have you talked to anybody else here yet?" "No, you're the first one." "Well, if you don't mind my giving you some advice," he said, "just tell them about the patents you got from your work at Berkeley and all of that, and don't mention this." And somehow, by prior experiences, I did that. So I didn't talk about it, and I got hired. And I tell you more things, too. It's like I had applied that spring in '57 to Stanford to say, I have experience in running a junior level computer laboratory about components and computing, etc., and I could come and start that in your place. And I got a letter back from the Dean of Engineering saying, "Well, I appreciate your interest in Stanford, but we're a small school and we have to specialize in really leading academic sort of things. And since computing is only a service activity, we don't contemplate ever starting any classwork in that." See?
Bill Duvall, which year did you arrive at SRI?
Well, I was actually much later on. I was in late 60s, late 68 or early 69. But you know what you were saying. There's some interesting. I'm not sure I've ever told you this story, but it's really kind of a fun one. When I'd been working in other parts of SRI, and when I wanted to join Doug's group, one of the things you had to do was, you know, after all of the interviews, was go talk to the head of the department, who I guess was Torben Meisling at the time, who was a fairly serious fellow. And of course, I was, you know, a young 20-year-old kid or 21-year-old kid. And he had this big office that had the bookshelves up the side and you know, the comfortable chair, and he sat down and he sort of looked at me and said, "You don't think that what they're doing up in that laboratory is really science, do you?"
And how did you answer that?
I said, "I thought it was, yeah." I thought that it was very forward, and you know, that's looking to the future. But he sort of, you know, it definitely was. I mean, it was a break from what was normal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And did that perception, Doug, of you as being far out, when you got funding, did the perception change?
Not for the first year, which made it really crippled what we were trying to do. But then this fellow, Joe Licklider, the one that came down to start this, came out and talked about it like that. And he was really quite alarmed, because he said if my boss found out what had been done here with the money, he says, I'd probably get fired, or I ought to get fired. So he had a heart-to-heart talk, and they sort of, okay, gave me my head to go on from there. And
you picked BillEnglish as an engineer. What other kinds of people were you looking for? What kinds of people were you looking for to make up your team?
Well, we needed software people, and this floundered for a while till we could get people that, we couldn't find software people for a while that were a match to his engineering people, see. And so it just took a while. It's not terribly surprising. So remember the 160A and the
Oh, that's right.
3200?
And Tom Humphrey was the programmer at the time.
Right.
And he was the only one at the time.
Yeah, and he didn't have the kind of background that...
No, he didn't have the right background for it. But he...
Of course, in fairness, I mean, that was during a period where there weren't software people.
Oh,
software
right.
hadn't been invented.
That's
I mean,
right.
that was, you know, when I joined SRI, actually, I think in '66, and the reason I joined SRI was I'd been at University of California, and I'd taken every computer science course they had to offer, which were all under the electrical engineering department.
Sure.
And there was nothing else to do, because there were no computer science departments in universities at that time.
Mm-hmm.
It was very new. So.
Yeah.
When did Stewart Branch show up on the scene, and how did he meet the augmented, the human intelligence group?
No. Wasn't Stewart Branch introduced by Dick Raymond?
Yeah.
Yes, Dick Raymond was, I guess you knew Dick for a long time.
Yeah, Dick Raymond ran a little progressive activity, I guess it was mixed consulting and goodwill or whatever.
Portola Institute.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little consulting operation, and he knew Stewart Branch.
So one of the things that Stewart at the time was just starting to write his Whole Earth catalog.
Mm-hmm.
So he lived in a cabin up over the hills, and so I don't know, we'd see him off and on and find out about that. So the way he got involved more explicitly was in 1968 presentation. We needed some extra camera people.
Well, he asked, did you write anything for the catalog?
I don't know.
I know I had a brief bit in the first catalog because he asked.
What did you write for the first? Tell me the story of writing for the first catalog.
I don't even remember the subject at this point. It was very brief, but he had. I know he asked a number of us if we would contribute anything to the first catalog, and I'd have to look at it.
Was it probably about technology? Is that your guess?
It's something about, yes,
yeah.
and I simply don't. It was very minor.
Yeah.
And that was the first contact I had with him, really.
But at that point, by the late '60s, there was this thriving counterculture in the Bay Area.
Oh,
it
yes.
really was and I'm interested if there were points of contact between the Augment group and the counterculture that you remember.
Well, we've talked about a number of them. Dick Raymond was one, Stewart, certainly, Stewart Branch, Jim Fadiman, Neil Lindgren to some extent. I was very much involved in that.
And you know, from this great distance of history, what I remember is that a lot of the counterculture was actually had an anti-technology flavor. And yet here you guys were in sort of the pure heart of the technology world. And did that create a tension?
You know, I didn't sense an anti-technology flavor, an anti-military flavor, certainly, and the technology as it implied to the military. And in fact, that's what so many of the marches about SRI were in the late 60s, I mean.
Yeah.
But I never personally felt any anti-technology flavor in that. In fact, people in the counterculture would get very involved when you talked about technology.
Yeah, in fact, I think that, you know, by the time I joined the group, there's a real feeling that the kind of technology that we were working on was perhaps the only chance for mankind to survive. I mean, it was really, you know, I think a belief that, you know, as the population got greater and the world became a more complex place, that you know, we needed some sort of information, communications, and collaboration systems of the type that we were working on in order for that to all work. Yeah. And wasn't that sort of one of the...
That's the picture that launched me in 1951.
Yeah. Well, tell me about the picture. Talk a little bit about that picture that launched you. I mean, sort of from scratch.
Well, it started out I got engaged. I'd been working at NASA Ames for 2.5 years, and I got engaged one Sunday, I guess, and the next day, driving to work, it suddenly dawned on me that, geez, I'm going to get married and live happily ever after, and I got a steady job. Suddenly, what more goals? So, if you grew up in the Depression, you know, those are probably very simple goals. So that made me really start thinking about career-wise. Well, what do I want out of a career? And I finally even characterized it by saying, figuring out that I probably, by the time I was 65, I would have spent 5.5 million minutes working. And what kind of return on that investment? And then I thought, well, what kind of return am I interested in? Earn a lot of money? And I says, well, let's just say enough is okay for a while to see if there's anything else interesting. So I was trying to think, I finally phrased it as, what could a career do to maximize its value to humanity? Really, practically, literally, see. And so I was spending lots of my time off work thinking about that. And finally, about 2.5 months later, after I'd thought of quite a few different crusades, I was one Saturday morning just saying, God, you know, because you'd think of a crusade and you'd realize it was very complicated to organize it and get it going in the first place, because crusades are just not like other kind of business ventures. And then it says, okay, so you aim at a target, something you're going to fix. So by the time you get it fixed, the complex environment is such that maybe the side effects of what you changed are going to be as bad as what you tried to correct. You know, it's like if you go clear the swamps. But so then I just realized, hell, the world's so complex, and that's its problem. And the world's changing, and it's getting more and more complex, more rapidly. And the only way mankind deals with it is collectively. So how do we get mankind collectively more capable? And so that was, then I got the picture of the computers. And because I'd been a Navy electronics technician and worked with radar, I didn't know how a computer really worked, but I knew it could punch cards and print. So I just knew from the electronics of it and such that you could put anything you want on a screen. And since radar also watches an operator, that a computer could be watching a user, and you could just, geez, the computer can so easily make so much more symbology could be so much more meaningful to us than what the printer can do, and give you mobility. And gee, you could even have people with their workstations tied into that same complex, and you could collaborate in brand new ways. So that image just dominates.
Bill English, do you remember discussions inside the Augment group about politics of the day? I mean, were those things part of the air that you guys breathed?
Mm-hmm. I mean, not terribly profound, but we were certainly aware of it. We talked about it, particularly the times when there were the marches on SRI. We would look out the window and see those, and new people involved in them.
And sort of, how did it affect the group?
I think, if anything, it kind of solidified the group. I mean, we identified with those people, but if anything, it sort of brought us together in our approach to the world at the time.
And at the same time, you had a contact point with ARPA, which was a rarefied part of the Pentagon, but it was still part of the Pentagon. Did you ever get sort of an odd feeling, sort of going back and forth between, you know, your friends on the outside and then this world that they were so upset about?
Doug may have more than the rest of us did. I mean, he was really the point man in contacting ARPA.
Everything involved with that were people, that this whole thing was something for the world. It wasn't just for the military. So none of the individuals at ARPA or in their contractors' world was oriented just about we're fixing up the military. No one even...
I think certainly from my perspective, it's something that we were all acutely aware of, that there was a sort of a little culture in the group that, you know, if you looked at you know, how they felt about things and how they looked at things and how they thought about things and how they talked about things, that it was just like oil and water with the people that were providing the funding at some level. At least I know I certainly felt that. And
I didn't.
Pardon? You didn't feel that?
Well, I didn't feel that as much, particularly when Bob Taylor got involved. I mean,
yeah.
I felt Bob Taylor was much more of a kindred soul in all of that. Larry Roberts was more distant.
He came after, though. He came after Bob.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Anyway, but he remember how he came once and said he was going to set us up with a really brand new level of support in the spring of '74. And
I wasn't there in '74.
Oh, that's right. But he came and it just looked like a godsend. He's told us, because we had a lot of things going and we were already supporting people out over the ARPANET, he started quietly starting to plan a new program about how you could use computers to support management of organizations and projects. And he said, he came and stopped by and he said, I've been talking to all the other PIs and I keep coming by here and I find out that you guys have the ideas about how you can deal with all the knowledge and interaction and collaboration, and you're also just totally ahead of anybody else in the software architecture about what all this is about. He said, so I'm going to make you the centerpiece of this new program, and I'm going to double your support level. And that was probably June-ish or something like that. And since our contract anniversary was in January, he says, so next January, just plan on it getting doubled. He says, so work up the proposal during the summer and we'll get it. So we wrote the proposal and worked on it. And then we also have to start planning to boost staff, et cetera, for them. And so in September, he called up and said, well, it's all written and signed. I've signed it off, so it's going to go through, so you can just rest assured. And by the way, I'm leaving to go help start up somewhat of successful new things. But don't worry, it's all wired. Well, it turns out his replacements didn't quite think that way. And so I got a call in December saying, we've decided that you guys are in the wrong direction and we're going to just cut your salary, cut your support to zero.
Wow.
And so there was a lot of thrashing for a month or two and they just cut it down, but not to zero. But there's so much that depends upon people's perceptions of what's going on, what's probable. And that just led me, even before that, this whole thing of what people's conceptual framework or paradigms are, and just totally what's involved in whether or not different paths to the future get followed. And that's been just over and over and over again the main thing that crippled us. It drove us out of the research world in the late '70s.
Let me ask about some people who were part of your group at different times. Maybe Bill English, you could just start by describing, describe David Evans to me and what his role was and what kind of a person he was.
Oh, Dave Evans was getting his PhD at Stanford at the time. And he's so connected with the program that we had that he decided he was going to do his dissertation on the system, on the NLS system at the time. And he was part of the counterculture, and that's a sort of different story about some of the things he did. But his real involvement was producing his PhD on the system. And I know he, remember his story of taking it to his committee, and they had a bunch of changes they wanted done. And he brought it back 2 days later, all completed, and they couldn't believe it. They had no idea anything like that could happen. It was a big thesis. And that was the big move that he made.
Bill Duvall, what do you remember about David Evans?
Well, I think the primary things I remember about David is, he just had an incredible amount of energy. I mean, he was just, I guess, the visual image of David Evans is he was so taken up with passion about what was going on and what the possibilities were and the direction of augmentation, that he would just come in and he'd bounce off the walls and sort of go around and infect everybody and everything and then continue. And he was just he was sort of like a dynamo that moved through for a while.
And he was involved in an event that I've heard of called Paradam.
Paradam, yes.
Do you remember Paradam, Doug?
Paradam was the meeting down in Santa Barbara on...
Oh, I didn't go.
You didn't go. Well, that
was just a week or so before that '69 ASIS presentation.
Oh yes, could be.
Bill English, tell me about Paradam. And there were a number of people who went from. It was it was an event that was. It was
an event, yes. You have to go back a little bit, I think, in what was going on at the time. When we finally got our big room and our multiple display, our 12 display video system, and really could have workstations. Those were the first real computer workstations because Doug had one in his office. we didn't have enough for everyone to have one in his office, so we set them up around the big room. And we were really, at the time, trying to be part of the counterculture, and we wanted to be different. We didn't want just a rigid workstation, and we built a number of different ones. We had one low one that you kneeled at. There's a great picture of Bill Duvall kneeling Japanese style at his workstation. We had stand-up workstations. We had a range of different types of workstations that sort of made you feel different, thinking of how you can affect the environment you're working in as well as just the machine. So we didn't want to just come up to a machine. And I think Dave Evans really connected with that, with the idea of making our environment different. And he organized the Paradigm Conference. Paradigm, isn't it? No, Paradigm. It's a word out of Dumal's Not Analog book. The paradigm is the stone you would find that would transform the way you viewed the world. Great concept.
And the event itself?
The event itself was down in Santa Barbara on, I forget whose property was that? Somebody would, do you remember?
No.
Domes, the guy who did Domes.
Buckminster Fuller?
No.
That was the other guy.
Anyway, it isn't important. We can get the name later. A ranch down there. And it was an event really organized, put together by Dave Evans with a lot of help. And we just all went down for 2 days of event.
And it was sort of the kinds of things you were talking about or thinking about were organizational issues or sort of transpersonal issues or a little bit of both?
A little bit of everything, you know. A lot of, it was pretty far out at the time. And we had the Texas Inflatables, who at the time brought an inflatable environment. They blew up with things you could climb through. We had Pacific High, what was the high school? Pacific High at the time?
Yeah, Pacific High.
Pacific High, which is where Bobby Weir went, member of the Grateful Dead. Was there any?
No, there were some other groups there. Again, I don't remember all the groups, but it was an event of that sort, and people stood up and gave different speeches about things.
It was the first place I'd seen Wavy Gravy.
Yes.
Yeah,
right.
Well, that raises a question. You know, a lot of drug use during the 60s was simply a retreat from society. It was a retreatist, but there was another sort of strand where drugs were sort of in some way used to enhance creativity. And I was wondering whether you buy into that, the notion that drugs can have sort of a creative effect, or whether those two worlds should be totally separate.
It's interesting you bring that up, because there was a small group of people doing research on drugs before they got outlawed, and they got the idea of trying to assess the creativity impact. So they went around and selected people in the research field that had to talk us into it. I was one of them, to come and spend a day getting high and being tested. And so we had 2 such episodes like that, and they finally decided it had very mixed.
Had mixed results, but it was
because I seemed to be very sensitive to it, and I went too high to even participate when it
So it sort of made you really couldn't take advantage of sort of a middle level where you could actually maybe reflect on things.
The next time I invented some really interesting things, so because I realized they gave me a much reduced dose.
Bill, what's your remember? What was the name of the research group? Was it associated with SRI, or was it a separate group?
No, this was a separate group. It grew out of the foundation. Again, the names I forget. We need some coaching on the names. But it grew out of that. They originally did research on individuals, and when that was outlawed, they set up this program on research for creativity under drugs, and it was a small group. Bill Harmon was part of that.
Myron Stolaroff.
Myron Stolaroff.
Jim Fadiman, that's where we met him.
Yeah.
And as an engineer, I mean, was this your introduction to psychedelics? And
yes, indeed.
Did it change your outlook on the world?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It was an interesting program. They set up a range of tests, simple-minded tests that you would do beforehand, and then you would take it was LSD at the time, LSD enhanced by Ritalin, and then take tests afterwards.
And do you have any sense about those kinds of drugs and creativity? Is there any point of contact?
Oh, I think there is, yes. I think there definitely is. I think, again, that wasn't the way to use it. It was too much. But it changes your perception so much that it's really a different world.
Yeah. There was also a music scene. I mean, there was a really vibrant music scene in the Bay Area, and lots of people participated, mostly as the audience. I mean, do you remember the free concerts in El Camino Park during the late 60s? Did the music scene have any impact on your group, your research group?
Not that I'm aware of. We played music. We had music in the large room, and we played music quite a bit, but I don't think as such the scene had any profound effect.
And were you playing the music of the time? Were the San Francisco musicians, you know, present in the music you played?
Oh, yes.
At your, they had a big influence.
Well, we were doing other things. We'd have group meetings. And some of the photographs of that, everybody's sitting around on the floor. And then
yeah, that was part of the big room that we did. We put a carpet on the floor. We used to have meetings sitting around on the floor. We even, I believe, served wine at a meeting every now and then, which was unheard of in SRI.
And we sort of broke the dress code there, too.
The dress code was totally gone.
Was the dress code a coat and tie dress code?
Yeah. Pretty much at SRI, yes. I mean, it wasn't laid down by the company like IBM did, but it was the convention at the time.
You know, I think, I'm speaking for myself, you know, and I was sort of I was 21 years old, a young kid just out of Berkeley at the time, but one of the things that I really felt at the time was that in this kind of a job, I mean, this was sort of something new, being involved in software and, you know, in this type of a work situation where basically you didn't start at 9 in the morning and end at 5 in the afternoon. You know, sort of worked on it all of your waking hours in some form. That the old 9 to 5 coat and tie, you know, go home and you know, kiss the wife and have the dinner on the table model of life just didn't work. And so I know one of my concerns, and I think that this was sort of played around with by a lot of people in the group, was how do you integrate this new form of work with your life? I mean, how do these things fit together? You know, not in the old ways. And so, what are the ways that you can integrate these things? And I think that's where a lot of this idea of having the community that you work with came from.
So you were in those meetings that you had. You were talking about sociological things, or the sort of the organization of the workplace, as opposed to just the technology.
Well, both.
Oh yeah,
definitely both.
I mean, you're not going to get collective improvement if you don't think of that.
Yes, you have to think of the greater environment for sure.
In the 70s, we even launched a program we called Personal and Organizational Development. And so we divided the group up into small groups, and they had to meet and really talk about their own personal development as well as organizational, etc. And then after Duvall's great event of getting the journal working, then they had to submit it into there. It became a permanent report every week, whenever they had the meetings.
Describe Bill bringing up the journal. I mean, describe that event.
Well, it only took a year, wasn't it?
And when you say it, what was the it? I mean,
well, it's a whole special subsystem that you could attach to almost any kind of document environment. But it was, you know, we can't get the world to really appreciate it yet, which is something to do. But
it was a way of keeping a history.
Well, it just says anything you wanted, a one-liner or paragraph or 50-pager, you go through a process on the computer to say, I'm submitting it to a journal. And later there got to be like 20 different journals around being operated. And so it was something supported by the staff. And when you submitted it, it was an interaction. It took a copy of that and put it in there where users couldn't touch it. They could get copies of it and read it, but it was guaranteed that it wasn't going to be changed. And it was cataloged too, stuff like that. So you could search the catalog for things. So it's very much like a library or publishing. But that was extremely important to keep a record. So all those journal items from 1970 to 76 were printed out too. And Stanford now has all those binders of those in there. You know, to go back and...
I didn't know that. That's scary.
Yeah.
Doug, you mentioned sort of personal development issues. At that time, in the broader Bay Area community, there was a personal growth movement, and EST sort of swept through the Bay Area. Was your interest in personal development what attracted you to EST?
Well, in a way, that one of these groups, we call them pods. You know, one of the pods, somebody out there discovered just the emergent est stuff, and so they invited somebody to come down and talk about it, and we listened to that. So I said, well, I guess it seems reasonable, since we're investing in this anyway, to send a few people to that week, you know, the 2-weekend thing. So they came back just ludicrously high.
Yeah.
And when did all the other Russ's group? What era was that?
I was gone by then, I think.
No, but Russ
Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When was that?
I mean, when Russ leaves?
Yeah, when I was involved with that, the experience of that, and you were.
I may have been gone by then.
In the end, Doug, did you feel that the S stuff took a bad direction or a not useful direction?
Oh, well, then I went too later, and so I got more and more experience, because there I was sitting in as a manager of a laboratory in SRI, and Werner started casting around for people who had some sort of standing that he could get to be in his board of advisors. Oh. So for like 3 years I was on the board of advisors with just a cast of really interesting people. You know, John Denver was there, and actresses and judges and priests and stuff like that. But I was just more increasingly bothered by, you know, Werner's brilliant and very capable of the way he can move people and stuff, was something to really watch. But on the other hand, here he was going through all the work of having an ownership chain back through the Cayman Islands and stuff like that, which could have no healthy reason or something like that. And I couldn't get him to contact with that. So. But it was very educational anyway from all the other people involved.
It seems to me it took the wrong turn, definitely. I think it was very, very valuable information. I did it after I had left Doug's group, and not as part of the program he had set up. But I think there was some very valuable information there, no question about it, and not just information, experiences. But it went off in the wrong way by far.
I'm still interested in some of the members of your original group. Maybe, Bill, you could just describe Jim Fadiman to me and what role he played in the Augment team.
Well, Jim Fadiman was a psychologist, and I believe you brought Jim in. My sense is that you felt that the group was a little out of control.
Oh, that's a sort of a chronic situation.
and thought that Jim Fadiman could help.
Well, yeah, it's in trying to get people to work together and find out what their perceptions or perspective was about where we were going to go, and if there were misconceptions or feelings that that wasn't what they wanted to do, to try to unearth them and smooth it out. And it was just a big thing I remember through all those years was the stress for me, that it's like, you know, pointing off like that. It was very hard to keep communicating because there was lots of stuff to do at the time, but where it was all going to go was hard to keep on, you know, in our horizon. And I'd get flack from other parts of the Institute and from outside. And, you know, graduate student at, you know, somebody going to graduate school at Stanford would tell me that, hey, you know, they just don't have any respect for you at all over there. They think you're really off the ball. So you just, the artificial intelligence people would just openly snub and laugh. Anyway, it was just, there was always that stress, and it got worse and worse. And
his role was to help manage some of the...
It was really sort of, he didn't really do groups, but it was to help bring people together and manage some of that. He was a very easygoing psychologist.
One of the things I remember very explicitly that Jim did was I joined the Augmentation, you know, group about the same time as another fellow named Charles Irby, and we were sort of in the same role. And up until that time, there had been a very small core group of people that had been working on the programming, on the software, and I guess the proper way to put it was that, you know, they weren't sure that new people could really understand what some of the nuances were, so it was a little bit difficult to you know, find a position in this new group. And Charles and I were sort of both in the same position, and yet for some reason, you we weren't necessarily being allies. And so, Jim Fadiman basically took us together and said, look, you guys, you got the same problem. Why don't you just, I mean, you can be each other's greatest allies, so why don't you work in that mode? Not that we were enemies at the time, but he really pointed out that, we were experiencing exactly the same things, and by joining together, we could be a lot more effective.
When BillEnglish uses the term "out of control," can you think of some examples or some stories that come to mind? Either of you.
Well, I think there was for some reason, there was a great controversy over the name for the group at one time. I mean, Doug's name was the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center. And a number of people wanted Augmentation Research Center. I believe that was it.
I didn't have the slightest problem with that. When they finally suggested it, I didn't have the slightest problem with changing that.
Well, that's not my memory of it. I think that there was more controversy than you realize about that.
Well, I think we went through a number of different possibilities before we arrived at that one.
And what were the substantive issues underneath the controversy?
Nothing.
Well, no, I think there was an issue. I think the issue gets back to what I was talking about earlier, and that is that, everybody in the group was becoming a community, and when you're a community, you care what you're called. And I think everyone wanted to have a voice in that. So I think that was sort of some of the this emerging newness, if you will.
I'd like to get down on celluloid or whatever. Your recollections about I guess I think of it as the Watson come here quick moment of the ARPANET. There was this famous the first telephone call. Let's start with Bill Duvall. Sort of tell the story of the months leading up to the first message that went back and forth between UCLA, and who was involved and what your role was, and then I'll ask your other two as well.
Well, it's kind of hard to know exactly how far to go back on that. I think about 6 months before, perhaps a little bit more than that, the first connection was made between two hosts across the ARPANET. There was a group formed among the original 4 ARPANET sites called the Network Working Group. And this group met off and on for a period leading up to it to sort of try and architect what the initial protocols would be for sending messages back and forth to hosts. And then SRI and UCLA were selected to be the first 2 sites that actually had complete ARPANET installations, which consisted of a little computer called an IMP and then all the necessary telephone lines that connected them together. Then, there was sort of an anointed day. It was, I think it was actually a deadline in the contract someplace, as I recall, where we had to have some communications going between 2 hosts. And so what we did was, the folks at UCLA, I think, were originally going to be using a 360. And then there were some problems with the 360, so they switched over to a Sigma 7, which was a little more amenable to adaptation to the ARPANET. And they wrote a program down there so they could act like a user, typing characters, have them shipped out in the ARPANET, and then receive characters back from the ARPANET and have them displayed on a screen or a teletype. And then at the SRI end, we had an SDS 940. And I wrote a program for the 940 that would take characters coming in from the ARPANET, from the IMP, and make the 940 believe that that was actually a person at a teletype logging in locally to the 940, and then answer and send the characters back to UCLA. So we sort of got this Rube Goldberg device all hooked together, and somebody from UCLA then logged into to the SDS 940 at SRI. It was about, I think 10 o'clock at night, and we had a telephone link, and we're talking back and forth at the same time. And we, of course, it didn't come up right away as you'd like. I mean, it sort of crashed, I think, once or twice.
After LOG?
Well, yeah, that's the story, and I don't think that's quite right, but it's close. What I remember is that at one point, one of the computers sent a question mark to the other computer. And that was an unrecognized character, so the other computer responded by sending a question mark back to the first computer. And pretty soon there started a question mark war. And sooner or later, the buffers overflowed in one of the computers, and it crashed. And then we had to bring it back up. And it turns out the thing that started the first question mark, I think, was the automatic command recognition on the 940.
Now, who wrote the software, or who built the IMPs?
That was BB&N, I believe, Bolton, Rennick, and Newman.
So they supplied IMPs to both UCLA and...
Yes, that's correct.
SRI. And then what software did you write?
Well, I wrote the software on the SDS 940 that interfaced to the IMP and made the SDS 940 believe that the ARPANET was really just a person sitting at a local terminal.
Okay. What do you remember about it?
I remember very little about that. I knew it was going on. I wasn't really involved in it. It was this software group's project at the time.
Yeah. And Doug, did you track it closely?
Hey, Bill, what's going on? You know,
it really wasn't the most important thing going on. It was, oh yeah, we got to do this too. And we got the IMP and installed it, and that was.
Yeah. And do you remember talking? Were you the person at SRI talking to Charlie Klein?
I believe so. Yeah.
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 Who else was in a room or around or?
I don't think there was anybody else at SRI. I think there was somebody else at UCLA with Charlie. And my recollection is that may have been Vince Cerf or Steve Crocker.
Down there.
Down there, yeah. But I'm not sure who it was, but it was somebody. But it was basically, it was, I mean, like Bill said, it wasn't the most important thing we were working on. In fact, I think when it was first proposed that the ARPANET be brought to, to the group at SRI, sort of the general reaction was, oh no, do we really have to do that?
well, I'll tell you.
Pardon?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Doug can tell some stories about that. Yeah.
Tell us the story.
See, the principal investigators, there were like 13 different research groups around the country being supported by ARPA. So the principal investigator in each of those would be brought together every 6 months for collective meetings. So in the spring of '67, it was at the University of Michigan. And that's when the two guys running the office, Bob Taylor and Larry Roberts, just announced to everybody, well, we want to get this research going in computer networking. And we can't find volunteer Defense Department computers who don't want to get troubled, so we decided that your community would be our first network people. And this went over not very well among most people sitting there saying, oh God, that's going to tie up my people and everything. And such a funny reaction going on, and I just can remember it so clearly. I won't name the guys, maybe I can tell them, but they're each running a research project that they're very proud of, and it's the important research of the whole community, of course. So the idea for doing this was that you could share computational resources. There was no discussion about the sharing knowledge or something. So one guy turns to the other and says, well, what do you got in your computer that I could use? And he thought for a minute, but very quick minute, he comes back and says, well, don't you read my reports? And this guy says, oh, do you send them to me? Because of course he never was going to read anybody else's reports. And this guy realized he doesn't know where his reports go. So then they both turned and talked to Larry Roberts and Bob Taylor, saying, you guys have to provide us with the information of what's on the other computers. And actually they never thought about that. Huh. So there they were sort of blocked and stymied. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, it's the chance for a community. Mm-hmm. So then I volunteered to say, well, we could run an information center online for this. And okay, whew, such a relief, they gave it to us right then. So when I went home, the thing he was talking about is saying, hey, you guys, look what's going to happen. And this wasn't really uniformly accepted with great glee, because it meant that our kind of precious research was going to have to get diluted, and we're going to have to start supporting other people. You mean we're just going to be in the support business? We're in the research business.
And yet, that original vision of the possibility of a community, I mean, I came on the scene a decade later, and the first thing I discovered was Human Nets. Was this remarkable, did any of you read Human Nets? One of the early ARPA discussion groups. Very lively, with all kinds of people participating, and it really did create you created the infrastructure for a community, for many communities.
Sure,
it worked.
Oh, it works. Yeah, there are a number out there today.
But the thing was, the perception climate wasn't such that people would sort of grok that kind of thing. Just.
Well, I think people felt a real threat if somebody else was going to use your resources. They didn't connect with the idea of community at all. I think Doug is really the only one who did at that meeting. Do
you remember having a viewpoint? When he came back, were you alarmed that you were going to have to do all this?
No, I look forward to doing this.
So anyway, we were doing a lot of whole kind of software development, especially to support that NIC. So that was the real push to get all that working. And we'd just gotten the SDS the year before, so we were shifting in there someplace to the 10X, weren't we?
We shifted to 10X. I don't remember when, what was the date of the first message? 69, wasn't it?
Sometime late
October
69.
29th, 1969, my birthday.
Yes. We didn't go to the PDP-10 until 1970. I believe is the right date for that.
Yeah, so there was a lot of work going underway.
Work was underway to do it, yes, but we didn't switch.
That was a big distraction for that, as well as getting the software ready for the...
Yeah.
After you guys got rid of the 940, did you track what happened to it? Did you know what happened to the 940?
No, I don't.
There's a funny story, actually, which, at least in terms of my historian's work trying to build the ties between things, it went to a warehouse, and then, let's see, Transamerica Corporation ended up, because they were the leasing company, and then it ended up at this project in the city called Resource One.
Oh, sure.
They got a hold of it, and Ephraim Lipkin and Lee Felsenstein began taking care of it.
Now, Resource One had living, sure. In fact, I visited them and I wrote a letter recommending them as a recipient of the 940. I remember that now.
So it led to the people's, it led to community memory in Berkeley. They were the first group that brought something up on it. And that in turn sort of came back to the Homebrew Club.
Yeah.
Actually, were there points of, did you guys know about, or were you aware of either the People's Computer Company or the Homebrew Club in the early 70s? Were you aware of those things going on? And were members of your group connected in any way?
There wasn't much interaction at all, but aware of it. It's like we had such a heavy challenge for the direction we'd picked that we sort of didn't have time, and so we also had more experience in important domains there than the people involved in those. So it was hard to carry on the kind of a dialogue that harnessed for what our experience was.
But over and over again in my reporting on computing and the development of new technologies, I find that a motivating factor is people wanting access to this technology, this powerful technology themselves. I just see that everywhere. And that was going on outside. You guys had, I mean, you guys had the most powerful sort of personal computing environment in the world, and there were other people who were beginning to learn about it, and they were out playing with these tiny little machines in an effort to get some subset of something that you had access to, I think. I mean, does that square with your vision, Bill?
Yeah, I think that, you know, it's, I mean, this is kind of a, you know, a tough thing to try and get perspective on. I mean, I think from the perspective of the people that were working at the group, you know, we had this incredible compute power, and you know, I mean, sort of one of the things that you'd always try to do as a programmer is find some time that you could work that nobody else was working, so you had the entire computer to yourself. So you'd come at 5 in the morning, or you'd work at 2 in the, you know, whenever it was that you could really get, you know, this entire resource to yourself, because you knew that you could do things much faster and you could do a lot more. So, you know, I mean, that was really sort of where we were at. More compute power was sort of the feeling. And I think because of that, we didn't really have a lot of interest in, you know, going to the other end where you'd work very hard to get a little bit of compute power, because we were more interested in pushing the frontier of the technology that, I mean, you know, there were, one of the really exciting things about software in those days, and I think, you know, somewhat hardware too, but certainly from my perspective, was everywhere you look there was something that needed to be done. In other words, you were technologically limited in every single direction, and not only did it need to be done, but you could see a way of approaching the problem, and you could see a way of moving forward in that direction. You know, I think that's less true today, but then it was like, you know, if you could do a word processor, it didn't matter how difficult it was to use, that was a step forward. You know, now we evaluate word processors based on the command set and what the features are and things like that. Well, in those days, it was just doing that was a step forward, and in every direction there was, you know, that had that characteristic. So quite honestly, we weren't particularly interested in pursuing things that had less compute power, even though we might own them, because effectively we had access to them, and we just wanted to keep pushing that frontier.
Doug, how did you make the connection with Herman Miller? Where did that come from?
Well, they had a chief designer whose name I wish I could remember, because he was a very unusual fellow. And he's the one that innovated what they call modular office furniture. So Herman Miller was the first one out in the market with that, and he was the innovator of that. And my guess is that he looked us up, and he was very interested in what we're doing, and he actually invited me to come by in Michigan at their site, and they had a laboratory. It was a room about this big with a lot of these mock-up flexible consoles, etc. there, and we sat there and tried things and talked, and so he really wanted to help, and they actually voluntarily made, probably I would assume that they were working with you, made a first sort of a console chair with a swivel platform there that the keyboard and the key set and the mouse could all fit on. And then that could be sitting any place you want in front of it. So we've got a beautiful picture of Bill here sitting there with his feet up.
With him? Bill, you did some of the industrial design with him on sort of workstation
I worked with
design.
them on it. I mean, it was their design clearly, and they volunteered to do it. A great opportunity. It's the console. It's pictured in the Fall Joint Computer Conference. It's the one that Doug used there, but it was this movable surface on one of their chairs, and a display that you could move around. It was a flexible environment.
And did you get a number of them at the?
Just one. They built just one.
And then later, when you had that room, you were experimenting with other ideas. And
well, the big room was just, we built homemade consoles up there. I mean, it was just experimenting with different ones. The Herman Miller came after that, during that period, not really after it. The Herman Miller console was done.
But this was in so many areas where, you know, work group computing, for example, which, you know, 15 years later, still people were trying to make progress on. You guys had done a tremendous amount of work. When I think I need someone to walk me through sort of what led you into the, I mean, I understand the community stuff, but you were sort of the experimentation you did in building work groups. I'm trying to understand sort of the lineage of the ideas. I mean, was it all part of a single cloth, or what pushed you in that direction?
Well, it's part of the bootstrapping idea that was part of that report in 1962. And there was even some diagrams in there that were saying, well, if you're going to do the research, and the research is basically trying to get people so they can collectively work better, why don't you plow back and be sure that all the benefits that research produces come back and benefits the research group. And so that pushed us into saying, well, let's get all our software into this NLS stuff, and let's do all our work and our reports and everything else, so that everybody there was really a concerned user, which helped a lot, up to a point where we got up and we needed more exploration of different ways of working together. And that ran into a real problem. We kind of, especially the software guys, you know how they are.
It's all true.
And so I just decided, well, I think we better go find outside groups of users.
And was that also what led you to groups like the Portola Institute, which were thinking about sort of new paradigms for?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure when we were running into those guys.
No, I think your work in work groups was later than that.
Later, the Portola Institute stuff came earlier. And
oh yeah, that was before 60.
That was very early.
And the motivation for contacting them, at that point, you were looking for sort of a social psychology perspective, or?
You knew Dick Raymond from
it was just sort of a accidental contact, and it would seem like the kind of things he was doing would be overlapping with what we're doing, but we couldn't find any very explicit way to collaborate. That's all.
And are there other members of the group that we should know about? I mean, we've mentioned a couple. What other names come to mind as important contributors, technically or participants?
Well, Jeff Rulifson was a huge.
He's a major software contributor.
Yeah.
Did you work with Jeff?
Yeah, after a while. Jeff was there before I got there.
And he was doing applications or architecture?
It ended up that architecture and a lot of the basic stuff for the way we redid the NLS system several times. So it had started out actually operating much like the markup languages did, that's the way the statements and nodes and everything else were markups.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to make things more compact, Jeff innovated the double structure thing. But with each person, it's watching how they come and get integrated. And one of the things I remember about him is he came in and he's the only one that had a very advanced, he had a master's degree in computer science, remember?
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, I was showing him about the basics of NLS that we had then and the editing and things and moving around. And then I was showing him how you could do the hierarchical structure and manipulate things. And he just looked at me coldly and said, "I don't think like that." And he said it in a way that just said it's dismissed, that he's not going to fool around with that sort of stuff. But then it was only a matter of weeks later when we sort of start challenging the software people to say, why don't you move the source code in? Because that's a heavy knowledge work sort of idea. And he got started doing that, and the whole value then of all that hierarchy and stuff hit him.
Yeah.
Now, you had this group that had sort of broken down the traditional SRI dress code, and sort of there was a counterculture element. Were there any, and you were the point of contact with ARPA as a rule, but were there any events where the straight-laced generals came out and visited and were sort of taken aback by the loose culture?
No, not generals, but I remember 3 or 4 CIA people invaded us one day.
Tell me the CIA story.
Well, that was at the time when the riot sort of was going on, and I guess they wanted to be sure there wasn't anything in our files that, if we got marauded, would be that. So.
Oh, so the CIA came and did a security check or a security audit?
They went and looked through all our files and everything, I guess, to see whether what we were using would be in some way prejudicial or something. But that's otherwise.
Well, we did. I don't remember the context or where, but I know at one time we hosted some people from ARPA and concocted a brew we called the ARPA Punch, and I still have the recipe for that. It's fairly strong, and we served that to the visitors.
There was some alcohol in the ARPA Punch?
A bit, yes. I'll give you the recipe if you want.
I'd love it.
And another event that we did with the ARPA community was when we hosted a meeting and set up consoles around a square table, and that was very interesting.
Right. First computer-assisted meetings.
Computer-assisted meeting.
Were they struck? This must have been really unusual stuff at that time.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, we had, it was a big square table that we built especially for this. They had keyboards on the table, keyboard and mouse, and a console in front of you. And
Somewhere down low.
so you could see across it to other people at the table. And you could move control of this to different places. And people could point at things and share other screens. It was quite an event.
And the ARPA
There's some
people,
nice pictures of that.
Yeah, neat. And these people sort of saw for the first time a little bit of what was seen in public at the Joint Fall Computer Conference. Is that the kind of demonstration that was?
This was actually before that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But it was a hint of what you showed at the JFCC.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And were they blown away? Is that the right way to describe it?
How would you know?
Yeah, I couldn't tell. Pretty serious meeting.
Yeah.
But some of these people had seen it before, clearly. Bob Taylor and his crowd. We'd had visitors from other people in the ARPA community, a few at a time, one at a time, who saw what was going on. So I don't think any of them were terribly surprised.
But the flexibility, you could have the agenda flipped up, and then you could it would tell about something we'd written or done, so bingo, you could just go off and
just
pursue it.
Get all the reference and interlinked and indexed. And
back to the time surrounding the anti-war movement, Bill English, do you remember this particular part of that period called the April 3rd movement? And was that focused on SRI, or was that something?
I don't remember that.
Okay.
By that name.
I think that it was focused on the physics lab. That may have been one of the big events where they occupied the
At SRI, you mean?
Well, let's see. No, not at SRI. It was at that point. Where was SRI over in Menlo Park in the 60s already?
Oh yes.
So you were separate from campus.
Mm-hmm. And it was Stanford Research Institute, of course, and that was all this protest is what triggered the name change eventually.
The Augmented Human Intellect Research Center began, though, in a temporary building?
We began in a temporary building before the engineering building. There were some old military buildings on the property there.
Probably before we were labeled as center, too.
Yes.
We were too small.
It was too small. It was just Doug's small group. There were 3 of us, I guess, at the time. And then we...
Did you even have a computer at that point?
We started off with the, what was it, the CDC?
160.
168, no. 12-bit 4K memory. It was a wonderful machine.
And it was in the temporary building as well?
Yes, it was in the temporary building, and then we had the original big display at the time, and that's actually where we ran the first mouse experiments, which we did in '64, where we said, where I ran the experiments on different pointing devices to compare the effectiveness of them.
And you had built a 2-wheeled mouse by that time?
Oh yes, yes. Built a 2-wheeled mouse and other devices, used joysticks and knee control and a few assorted things like that.
Wasn't there a nose pointer at one point?
There was a nose pointer at one point. It wasn't part of the experiments, but that was a little awkward.
Tell me about who thought up the nose pointer?
Oh, Doug did.
It just seemed that it was the.
Well, it's the idea of, I'll say it, it's the idea of being able to focus on what you're looking at. And we didn't have really good eye trackers at the time, and there were some around much too expensive. And the idea that by looking at something you could get your focus there, your cursor there.
And what was the...
Well, it was a helmet. It was a helmet.
We actually had a joystick, and it occurred to me you could just put a stick out there and through a groove on a helmet out here like that. So if you move your head like that, it would be moving the joystick around.
And did you get it to work?
Oh yeah.
It was not very easy to use.
Yeah.
I mean, Doug had a lot of tenacity in learning new things, but it wasn't easy to use.
Bill, did the mouse at that early point already seem like the correct pointing device? Was it already winning the...
It seemed like the winner from the start. It was so easy to use, and everything else was awkward.
Yeah. And Bill, when you came in '67, had the mouse already sort of become inculcated in the culture, or were they still playing with...
Oh, the mouse was absolutely
There was nothing
critical.
else.
Yeah, I mean that was it. Mouse and key. There was also a key set at that time,
Yeah.
which was the 5-fingered.
got
Basically,
one.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
We'll get it out later.
Right.
After the experiments with the mouse, we didn't do anything else. We just built more mice. The temporary building you mentioned was interesting at the time. It was an old wooden building with a wooden floor over a dirt under it, and we put the computer in there. In fact, we put the 3100. The CDC 3100, when we moved it, we put it in that. And that was a little bit of the counterculture, you know. It wasn't a computer room. Anytime we had to run a cable, we cut a hole in the floor. And I remember, I wasn't asking SRI facilities or anything. I'd get my skill saw from home and I'd saw the hole in the floor and drop the cables through and do whatever we want.
So there was a little bit, you know, many years later when Steve Jobs started the Mac Group, he put up a pirate flag. Did you guys feel a little bit like pirates at SRI?
I guess somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there for that particular part of it, but you know, I just comment on that feeling. For me, at least, it wasn't so much of a pirate feeling. I think it was almost a leftover of the era coming out of World War II, that there was a can-do.
That's right.
Attitude about everything, and it wasn't necessarily that you were, you know, going off to be a pirate. It was just this job needed to be done. Let's do it.
That's right. And the only pirate. No, it wasn't pirate in the sense of stealing things. It was get the job done, and don't worry about the structure and the organization that gets in your way. Just do it.
Good Nike ad.
You may want